Well, thank you very much for attending this session. It shows you're all committed. So I'm glad to be talking already to the converted. Just to start off the situation here. The real problem is that we have an overabundance of greenhouse gas emissions. And we have, of course, in the background, we have the Paris Agreement, we have commitments to net zero in 2050, including from China. But on the other hand, there's a major distinction between the countries on this list. And the two top performers in terms of share of greenhouse gas emissions, China and the US, are not hard pledge countries. EU has made a legislative commitment to net zero by 2050. It has also made a commitment to reduce its emissions by 55% by 2030. That would bring their emissions back down to the level in 1990. The UK is also a hard pledge country, as is Japan. And hard pledge is really important in terms of motivating the broad kind of changes that are necessary to actually deliver net zero by 2050. It's too easy for soft pledge countries like the US, for example, to waft away from a commitment once the political winds change. The US is a really interesting case because, of course, on a per capita basis, its emissions are the highest in the world. Its emissions are twice those of China, 3 times those of the UK, and of course, India is way, way, way behind. And one of the things that is really important as the IPCC report that was issued on Monday establishes, is that we have highly dissimilar situations in relation to the burden of net zero. It's what they refer to as climate justice. Not only has the Earth already warmed 1.1 degrees, making 1.5 degrees a real challenge to achieve, but also there's a highly dissimilar impact. Obviously, rising sea levels threaten most of all island nations in the Pacific and countries like Bangladesh with low-lying areas. But the point is that climate change, rising sea levels threaten us all. In Europe, we tend to, I'm sure you've heard a lot of people joke about how great it is to have a warmer climate, warmer summers, the great British summer and so on. But that is a chimera because we actually have to be very concerned about the weakening of the Gulf Stream. And the weakening of the Gulf Stream is itself the product of the melting of the polar caps. And we will not enjoy a lovelier, balmier climate here in the UK. We will experience Arctic events, extreme weather events. We are already experiencing them all. So the science is really clear. We are losing 13% of the polar caps every single year, and per decade, excuse me. And all of these things are very clearly established by science. Finally, we have a consensus, I think, around the science. Back to the US. Obviously, the US is a very tricky situation. President Biden rejoined the Paris Agreement 2 years ago. We have an election next year. We know the Republicans are climate change deniers. They intend to, for example, tear up the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides for an enormous program of green subsidies to push and propel the shift to electric vehicles. That is probably among the most important shifts that will take place in terms of consumer behavior. And of course, I urge you all to buy an EV the minute, if you're, if you're into driving. I'm no longer into driving. Now, there's no question that we have this divide in our society between business, consumers, and of course the government. The government, of course, is nominally in charge in a hard pledge country like this one, but even in a hard pledge country like the UK, the UK has a sort of plan, let's say, but it lacks a lot of detail. The other problem is the UK government has an astronomically high level of debt. It has a gross debt to GDP ratio of 160%, and the UK government is addicted to growth for the purpose of tax revenues. It's very hard for any government that has a high level of debt to actually lean in hard into a net zero agenda. China doesn't have that level of indebtedness, but it has another problem, which is that it is addicted to a 5% growth target in its 5-year plans. So what we have is a collection of governments here. Even the hard pledged ones are going to find it very, very difficult to meet their 2030 target, which is, again, to reduce emissions by 55%. Now, we're 2023, that's 7 years away, and emissions are still rising globally. I just want to sort of, before I move on to the next slide, the pandemic, we all remember what it was like, 2020, lockdown, et cetera, and all that. And that entire freezing of air travel, personal travel, travel to work, and so on, only reduced global emissions by 5%. So imagine the scale of reduction in travel and so on that would be required as long as we're relying on fossil fuels. And that's why the transition to renewables is so important in terms of electricity generation, but also obviously in terms of the transition to electric vehicles. But there's nothing that's easy around electric vehicles either, because we need charging points. We need, these vehicles are still a multiple more expensive than combustion engine cars. The UK government has decided to ban the sale of new combustion engine vehicles in 2030. The EU was trending towards the same outcome, but in that case 2035, but Germany and France have now blocked that decision. But those are the sorts of government policies that need to be taken in order to propel this transition to electric vehicles and to more sustainable forms of transportation. I personally am a great believer in technology. I think we've seen tremendous evolution. We also have this incredible, in most of the countries that we're talking about, we have these incredible broadband networks. In fact, I think the word connected TV is associated with broadband. And that allows us to have enormous possibilities in terms of decarbonizing work, decarbonizing the delivery of services, and generally producing a better outcome, and also, obviously, air quality. Now, in the UK, we have, because it's a hard pledge country, we have mandatory reporting by businesses. Scope 1 is basically everything that you as a business are responsible for. And principally, it relates to your building, obviously the way in which you produce. A manufacturing company is going to have a very heavy carbon footprint. A service provider like ourselves or like yourselves, we have much lower carbon footprints. Scope 2 is what is indirectly associated with your activity. So this would be, for example, your suppliers, your vans, if you don't own them, if you rely on drivers and so on. And then scope 3 is more downstream of your activity. And it includes, for example, the sourcing of all your inputs, where things are made, whether, we know that lots of stuff is made in China. And of course, its importation requires transportation that is, of course, intense in fossil fuels. For most companies, actually, Scope 3, which is not a mandatory reporting category, for most companies, actually, Scope 3 is enormous in relation to Scope 1 and Scope 2. And there are companies that have become very ambitious about imposing conditionalities on their suppliers, on the sourcing of their products, in order to bring their overall carbon footprint down. There are many companies that are at the forefront of delivering net zero by 2035 or even 2030 in the TMT sector. Obviously, we're in a better position. We're not producing widgets and so on. But the point is, we have companies like Google, like Meta, that are not actually established in hard pledge countries, but they themselves have decided to be hard pledge in their own corporate conduct. In the case of Google, obviously servers are very energy intensive. Google uses a lot of offsets. But nevertheless, the point is that we have ambition among businesses, and including in countries like the US, which are not hard pledge and which do not mandate any form of reporting. Obviously, so there's a lot of amazing trackers out there, Net Zero Tracker in particular, which actually aggregates all the commitments of listed companies. There are many shareholders that are very interested in the climate profile of the companies that they invest in. And so here we have behind me, I'm sorry it seems a bit small, but so this is an aggregation of where companies are at in the UK. And as you can see, so this is, so companies can basically choose how they report, but this is per million of revenue. So, you've got big companies, small companies, and so on. And basically, what we really want to see is a downwards trajectory over time. And I think, as you can see, the BBC is doing very well down here in terms of reducing its footprint and its emissions. Again, one of the easiest ways of actually reducing Scope 1 emissions is obviously to switch to renewables. And there's an awful lot of scope for expanding renewables at this point. Clearly, now, I just want to talk a little bit about Sky, because Sky is a best practice. Sky is by far and away the leader in the UK in terms of adopting a really deep approach to the climate crisis. It infuses itself throughout the entire company, including the content they commission, including the products like SkyQ that they develop, and also they foster among their employees a commitment and adherence to resolving and mediating, let's say, the climate crisis. And that means that the employees of Sky become ambassadors in their own lives and in their own social circles for climate change. They become much more responsible themselves for their carbon footprint. And it is a holistic approach which is possible for a media company to pursue including in terms of their physical operation, their broadcasting, and so on. But more than anything, it's about the culture. And ultimately, I think the way in which they commission content, the messaging that they want to lean into, these are incredibly important aspects of advancing the climate change agenda. We need to have a mobilization of businesses and of consumers in both mandatory and voluntary ways. I believe very much in voluntary engagement, in creating a new public good, which is a community that actually respects and inhabits its environment in a sustainable way. So that kind of vision is something a business can actually assist and foster and develop in its own activity. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Now, we got questions. We got a little time for questions. I think we've got just maybe not.
No, I think we do have time for questions.
Okay.
Does anybody?
We have another panel on in exactly 4 minutes, so
No, I
I'm
think we'll be
terrified
okay.
of.
Got a question at once. I'll run to you, give you the mic.
You talked about the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and that even companies countries that haven't made hard pledges, some of the companies are still doing the right thing and trying to reduce their footprint. Is there any obligation, even though they don't run from, so Google as an example, that operate in other countries that are hard pledge, is there any obligation, given that they operate in those other countries, that they should be doing that, or is it purely voluntary for them to make that decision?
Yeah, it's purely voluntary. But, it's about their brand image. You can't be, I mean, we all know that the internet obviously is, it seems immaterial, but actually it requires an awful lot of energy to power servers. And obviously, Google is a major economic force, and for it to be a bad citizen of the planet would really not look good. I think it's very motivated by their desire to make themselves, remember this was a company that said whose motto was do no evil, right? And so in terms of that, okay, they don't have that motto anymore. But anyway, never mind. The point is that, it's still there, in terms of their core corporate ethos, which is to mitigate and offset. They're a big purchaser of renewables, so a lot of their server farms are now directly linked up to renewable sources of energy. So they've moved rapidly off fossil fuels as the source of energy. But then, of course, is the problem of intermittency. But never mind. I mean, the point is that the will is there. Yeah.
Wonderful.
To get to net zero, is it even possible to replace all the fossil fuels we use with renewable energies?
I think the really big issue is airline travel, transportation. The problem is that we have, enormous networks of, container ships, this kind of thing. But actually, if you look at the contribution of air travel and transportation, shipping, and so on, to greenhouse gas emissions, it's actually really small. I mean, the big buckets are fossil fuel related transportation of people and, of course, businesses. 50% of electricity use in the UK is business use, buildings and so on and all the rest of it. So I think, those are the big buckets that we need to tackle. And in terms of, an immediate impact. And the problem of renewables is really that, although is basically the problem of storage, intermittency. We know this very well here in the UK because, we've got lots of wind. But of course, when the wind doesn't blow, it doesn't blow anywhere. And we don't have wind-generated electricity. So for example, on the coldest day of the year, only 3% of our electricity was generated by renewables. So we had to fire up the gas.
So we have to change our ways more than changing kind of the fuels that we're using.
Yeah, I think we need to balance, we need to sort out the problem of intermittency. And that's where demand management voluntary measures come into play, in terms of, people understanding how to optimize their use of electricity in a way that's much more friendly. I'm an economist, right? So as an economist, everybody goes through the price mechanism and says, oh, well, we incentivize or we hike the price up and so on. But I actually believe that everyone who's aware of the climate crisis is going to lean into their own pattern of, and change their own pattern of behavior. So that means reducing demand and leaning in to, for example, times when the wind doesn't blow. You just don't run your washing machine. It's just that simple. So you don't burden the grid. Unfortunately, in this country, with the energy price guarantee, unfortunately, that's really masked the impact of the energy crisis. And as a result, people are still being incentivized, if you like, to use as much energy as they possibly could want. Now, I believe that focusing only on the supply side is wrong. We have to really focus on demand and on the demand side, and the businesses are very good at doing that. They don't control, obviously the price mechanism for energy and so on. So I feel like it's much more about these holistic approaches, voluntary buy-in, shaping change your own behavior. And then, that's already a start.
But do you think humans can ever put, the needs of the planet before their margins?
Well, that's a good point. In fact, your colleague right here was saying the same thing to me, is that, as a business, we're out there saying to people, buy, buy all sorts of stuff you don't need and so on and all that. There is this issue, right? Are we going to be willing to accept much lower levels of economic growth as it is currently measured, right? Don't forget, economic growth is measured independently of its impact on the environment. We could really start by some proper green accounting of, what's really going on in terms of the impact of growth on the environment. So we can go for that. Oh,
Do we have another question over here? 1 second.
This is actually not so much of a question, it's just following up on this because it's such an interesting discussion. So I work for OpenX, we're a programmatic SSP, and we are actually certified as net zero. So you actually it is possible for businesses to do it, for one thing, and also it really goes hand in hand with business efficiency. So actually reducing our carbon footprint by 96% overall since 2018 has actually driven massive profitability in our business. So the two go hand in hand as far as we're concerned. Obviously we're an ad tech vendor, so it's easier for us to have got to net zero in comparison to a Sky and so on. But just wanted to follow up on that point. That's definitely possible.
Fantastic. I'm glad we could end on that optimistic note. We are going to have to rush along with the agenda. Everybody give a hand to Alice. Thank you so much.